Hello, bored people, and welcome back to Muted History. Before we begin tonight's journey, take a moment to breathe. Whether you're lying in bed scrolling through endless feeds, sitting at your kitchen table, avoiding responsibilities, or walking through the quiet hours when the world feels too loud, this is your space to slow down. Tonight, we're not chasing viral moments or shouting over algorithms. We're diving deep into something that shaped us before we even knew we were us. This is science told softly, history explored patiently, for minds that crave substance over noise. If this kind of thoughtful, long-form content helps you think differently, consider hitting that like button. It tells the algorithm that maybe, just maybe, there's still room for curiosity in this world. And if you're new here, you've found a corner of the internet where questions matter more than quick answers. So settle in, turn down the lights if you want. Let the modern world fade just a little, because tonight we're travelling back to when our ancestors first encountered something that would change everything. Not through conquest, but through a slow, careful dance with danger itself. This is the story of fire and us, not the myth of Prometheus stealing flame from the gods, but something stranger, more gradual, and infinitely more human. The question we're exploring isn't just when we learned to make fire, but whether we ever truly mastered it at all, or if we've been borrowing it this whole time. Let's begin. Picture the Earth, 420 million years ago. No humans, no mammals, no birds singing in trees that didn't yet exist. The continents we know today were scattered puzzle pieces, and life clung mostly to the oceans. But something was changing in the thin layer of air above the ancient land masses. Oxygen levels were climbing toward a critical threshold, 15% of the atmosphere. At exactly that moment, for the first time in our planet's history, three elements came together in perfect, dangerous harmony. Fuel in the form of the earliest land plants, oxygen finally thick enough to feed combustion, and ignition delivered by lightning strikes from primordial storms. Fire was born, not as a human tool, not as civilization's cornerstone, but as a wild, elemental force that would reshape landscapes for hundreds of millions of years before we ever walked upright. The evidence for these ancient flames comes to us as charcoal, fossilized carbon that tells the story of plants that burned but didn't fully consume. These fragments, locked in rock layers from the Silurian period, are Earth's oldest fire signatures. They whisper of a world where flame danced across primitive wetlands and early forests, leaving behind blackened trails that would eventually become seams of coal. This wasn't the dramatic inferno we might imagine. Early plants were low, sprawling things, nothing like the towering trees that would come later, but they could dry out, and when they did, they burned. Lightning provided the spark, oxygen fed the flames, and slowly, fire began to write itself into the story of life on Earth. As we move forward through deep time, something remarkable happens. By the Carboniferous period, roughly 350 million years ago, atmospheric oxygen had climbed even higher, possibly above 30%. This was the age of fire, when the air itself was more flammable than today. Insects grew to enormous sizes in this oxygen-rich atmosphere, and forests of primitive trees stretched across vast swamps. But with that oxygen came fire on a scale we can barely comprehend. Wildfires during this period may have been hotter, faster, and more widespread than anything in recorded history. The charcoal record explodes during this time, testament to a world where fire was not an occasional visitor, but a regular architect of the landscape. Here's where the story takes its first crucial turn. Life began to adapt to fire, not just survive it. We start seeing the evolutionary signatures of what scientists call fire-adapted traits. Plants developed thick bark, seeds that only germinated after heat exposure, and rapid regrowth abilities. Fire wasn't just destroying ecosystems, it was shaping them, creating new ecological niches, and selecting for organisms that could not just endure burning, but actually benefit from it. This is important because it establishes a pattern we'll see repeated throughout our story. Fire was never just a destructive force. From the very beginning, it was a creative one, clearing old growth to make way for new life, cycling nutrients back into soil, and creating the mosaic landscapes that many species would come to depend on. But fire is fickle. During certain periods in Earth's history, when oxygen levels dropped below that critical 15% threshold, combustion became nearly impossible. We know this from gaps in the charcoal record, stretches of tens of millions of years where fire seems to have vanished from the planet entirely. The flame went out, and then, when conditions shifted again, it returned. By the time the first dinosaurs appeared in the Triassic period, fire had become a permanent part of terrestrial life. Lightning-sparked wildfires raced through fern prairies and early coniferous forests. Some of the most fire-adapted plant lineages we know today, pines with their thick bark and resin-rich wood, certain eucalyptus species with their fire-triggered seed release, trace their evolutionary strategies back to these ancient partnerships with flame. And still, no one was watching. No creature gathered around fires for warmth or light. No minds contemplated the mystery of combustion. Fire existed as a purely natural phenomenon, sparked by physics, fed by chemistry, shaped by wind and weather, but unclaimed by any intelligence. This would remain true for an almost incomprehensibly long time. After the asteroid impact that ended the Cretaceous period, 66 million years ago, ecosystems reorganized around new rules. Mammals began their slow rise to prominence, eventually giving way to the first primates. Forests regrew, grasslands expanded, and fire continued its ancient dance with vegetation and climate. Then around 7 million years ago, something began to shift. Not in fire itself, it remained the same wild, unpredictable force it had always been, but the landscape was changing in ways that would eventually bring fire and our ancestors into contact. The spread of grasslands across East Africa created a new kind of fire environment. Grass burns differently than forest. Faster, hotter in the moment, but cooler overall, and it regenerates quickly. This created a rhythm of regular burning during dry seasons, followed by rapid regrowth when the rains returned. Lightning fires in these savannas became more frequent, more predictable, and more visible. Somewhere in this mosaic of burned and unburned patches, early hominins were beginning to take notice. We don't know exactly when this awareness began. Consciousness doesn't fossilize, but we can see it indirectly in the choices our ancestors started making about where to sleep, where to forage, and where to find safety. Modern primates provide us with clues about what this early relationship might have looked like. Chimpanzees, our closest living relatives, are not afraid of fire in the way many animals are. They watch it with what appears to be curiosity rather than panic. They understand its directional movement and seem to grasp that it creates opportunities as well as dangers. They don't flee in terror, they observe and adapt. If early hominins possessed similar cognitive abilities, and there's no reason to think they didn't, then they would have noticed that fire changed things. Burned areas were easier to walk through, cleared of thorny undergrowth. The soil in recently burned patches often yielded easier to dig roots and tubers. Small animals killed by fires could be scavenged. The ground was warm, dry, and less infested with insects. This is where we encounter the first crucial concept in understanding humanity's relationship with fire: passive interaction. This means using something without controlling it, benefiting from its presence without creating or directing it. Many animals engage in passive fire interaction. Australian raptors, known as firehawks, have been observed picking up burning sticks and dropping them in new locations to flush out prey. Some insects navigate toward flames for warmth. Elephants are known to linger near burned areas to feed on new plant growth. None of these behaviours require symbolic understanding or abstract thinking. They are practical, learned responses to environmental opportunities. There's no reason our ancestors would have been excluded from this spectrum of fire-aware behaviours. By 3 million years ago, early hominins were already demonstrating the kind of cognitive flexibility that would make them particularly well-suited to this kind of environmental awareness. The Australopithecines were spending increasing amounts of time in open habitats. Their diets were becoming more varied, and some populations may have begun using simple stone tools. This behavioural flexibility may have made them especially attuned to environmental disturbances like fire. A group that could recognise the patterns of burning, understand how to safely approach fire sites, and exploit the opportunities fire created would have had significant advantages, not just nutritionally, but socially and cognitively as well. But we must be careful not to project modern human behaviours backward onto these early ancestors. There is no evidence that 3 million-year-old hominins were capturing fire, maintaining it, or using it to alter their behaviour in any sustained way. Fire at this stage remained wild, its rhythm still entirely natural. What may have begun during this period was something subtler but equally important: familiarity, the development of a relationship with fire based not on fear or avoidance, but on observation and opportunistic use. Before fire could be controlled, it had to be known. Before it could be made, it had to be seen, again and again, in different contexts and conditions. The savannas of early Pliocene Africa may have provided exactly this kind of repeated exposure, not as dramatic revelation, but as ongoing education. The archaeological record from this period gives us tantalizing hints, but no definitive answers. We find stone tools and butchered bones, evidence of increasingly sophisticated behaviour, but no clear fire signatures. The charcoal we do find could represent natural wildfires rather than human-controlled burning. This absence of direct evidence is actually significant. It suggests that whatever relationship early hominins had with fire remained largely passive, opportunistic rather than deliberate, reactive rather than proactive. But even passive relationships can be transformative over evolutionary time. Groups that learned to read fire's patterns, to approach it safely, and to exploit its aftermath may have gained advantages that accumulated over generations. Not dramatic leaps forward, but small consistent benefits that slowly shaped behaviour, cognition, and culture. In this early phase of our story, fire was still entirely nature's domain, but our ancestors were beginning to enter its sphere of influence, not as masters or creators, but as increasingly sophisticated observers. They were learning fire's language without yet knowing how to speak it themselves. This sets the stage for everything that follows, the slow transition from watching fire to following it, from following it to maintaining it, and eventually from maintaining it to creating it. But we're still millions of years away from that final threshold. For now, in this ancient African landscape, there were simply small groups of upright walking apes beginning to pay attention to the flames that flickered across their world. Not understanding what they were seeing in any modern sense, but slowly, patiently learning its rhythms. The real story of fire and humanity was just beginning, and it would unfold not through sudden inspiration or technological breakthrough, but through the accumulation of countless small encounters, each one teaching our ancestors something new about the dangerous, useful, beautiful force that would eventually reshape their world and ours. This is where our journey truly begins, not with the first human-made spark, but with the first human eyes that looked at wildfire and saw something more than just destruction, something worth watching, something worth learning from, something that might eventually be worth approaching. The flame that would one day light our way to the stars was already burning. We just hadn't learned to reach for it yet. The question that haunts every campfire is simple: who lit the first one? But as we peer deeper into the archaeological record, that question begins to fragment into something more complex, more unsettling. Because the evidence suggests our relationship with fire didn't begin with a moment of triumph, but with millions of years of something closer to stalking. Around 2 million years ago, something new was walking the African landscape. Homo erectus emerged with longer legs, broader shoulders, and a brain that was beginning to nudge upward in size. These weren't the tree-climbing specialists of earlier eras. This was a species built for endurance, for covering ground, for living in the open spaces where fire was most likely to be encountered. At sites like Kubifora in northern Kenya, we find the scattered remains of their world: stone tools, butchered bones, and something else. Patches of earth that seem to have been altered by heat, not dramatically, not obviously, but in ways that suggest fire had passed through these spaces where early humans were living. The evidence is subtle. Reddish sediments that have been chemically transformed by temperatures above what sun or decomposition could achieve. Stone flakes that show thermal fractures consistent with exposure to flame. Animal bones with heat damage that doesn't match the pattern of natural wildfires. None of this proves that Homo erectus could make fire, but it suggests something almost more intriguing, that they were living alongside it, perhaps following it, maybe even maintaining it for brief periods when opportunity allowed. Think about what this means behaviourally. To live near fire without being consumed by it requires a level of understanding that goes beyond simple fear or attraction. You need to grasp its directional movement, its fuel requirements, its relationship with wind and weather. You need patience, observation, and the kind of memory that can hold patterns across seasons. This is where we encounter one of the most important concepts in understanding early human fire use: the difference between making fire and keeping it alive. Making fire from scratch, striking sparks, nurturing tinder, building flame from nothing, is incredibly difficult. Even today, with modern knowledge and tools, it requires skill, practice, and often multiple attempts. But keeping fire alive once you have it, that's a different kind of challenge. It requires attention, the right fuel, protection from wind and rain, and most crucially, it requires never letting it go completely cold. This may have been humanity's first true relationship with fire, not as creators, but as custodians. The archaeological record from this period is maddeningly sparse when it comes to direct fire evidence. Ash disperses, charcoal decomposes, and the temporary hearths of mobile groups rarely leave the kind of permanent signatures we can easily detect. But the hints we do have paint a picture of humans who are becoming increasingly fire-aware. At Chesawanja in Kenya, roughly 1.4 million years ago, researchers found small fragments of clay that had been altered by intense heat. The temperatures required, between 400 and 700 degrees Celsius, are well beyond what natural processes typically achieve. Something hot had touched this clay, something sustained enough to cause permanent chemical changes. The fragments were found alongside simple stone tools, the kind associated with early Homo populations. No hearth structures, no organised fire pits, just heat-altered earth and the debris of daily life scattered nearby. It's tantalising evidence that fire and early humans were sharing the same spaces, even if we can't yet prove direct control. Similar patterns emerge across other early sites: burnt bones here, heat-fractured stones there, always in contexts that suggest human presence, but never with the clear architectural signatures of deliberately constructed hearths. It's as if fire was flickering at the edges of human experience, close enough to be useful, but still wild enough to remain unpredictable. But there's another player in this story that we often overlook: the landscape itself. The Africa of 2 million years ago was a continent in ecological transition. Climate cycles were becoming more pronounced, alternately expanding and contracting forests and grasslands. This created exactly the kind of mosaic environment where fire would be most frequent and most visible. Lightning strikes during dry seasons would ignite grass fires that could burn for days across vast areas. These weren't the catastrophic crown fires that consume everything in their path, but slower, more manageable ground fires that early humans could potentially follow, observe, and learn from. In this context, fire becomes less of a tool and more of a teacher. Each encounter would have provided lessons about combustion, fuel, timing, and safety. Groups that paid attention to these lessons, that developed strategies for approaching and exploiting fire sites, would have gained advantages that accumulated over time. Archaeological evidence suggests that some early human populations were indeed becoming more sophisticated in their fire-related behaviours. At sites in East Africa, we begin to see spatial organisation around areas of burning. Tools and bones cluster in patterns that suggest people weren't just randomly encountering fire, but returning to places where they knew it was likely to occur. This represents a cognitive shift that's easy to underestimate. To repeatedly visit fire sites requires not just memory of location, but understanding of seasonal patterns, weather cycles, and the ecological conditions that make fire more or less likely. It's a form of environmental prediction that demands both intelligence and patience. Yet we still can't point to clear evidence of fire creation during this period. No friction sticks, no strike stones, no preserved tinder bundles. The technology for making fire from scratch may have been beyond the reach of these early populations, or it may simply be invisible to archaeological detection. What we can see is increasing sophistication in fire-related activities. At some sites, burnt materials are found in protected locations, suggesting they may have been deliberately placed there. At others, the arrangement of stones and ash hints at primitive windscreens or fuel management strategies. The most intriguing evidence comes from sites where fire appears to have been used for more than just warmth or protection. At Swartkrans in South Africa, bones show evidence of controlled burning that may represent early attempts at food processing. The temperatures and duration of heating suggest something more deliberate than accidental exposure to wildfire. This kind of controlled burning represents a significant cognitive leap. It requires understanding not just that fire changes materials, but how different levels of heat create different effects. It demands the ability to regulate temperature and timing, to experiment with process and result. But even these sophisticated behaviours might not represent true fire mastery. They could still fall within the realm of fire management, maintaining and directing flames that originated elsewhere rather than creating them from scratch. The distinction matters because it affects how we understand early human cognition and culture. A species that can maintain fire is intelligent and adaptable. A species that can create fire on demand has crossed into a different category of technological sophistication entirely. As we move forward through this period, we see hints that this threshold was approaching. Sites become more numerous, fire signatures more consistent, and the spatial organisation around burning more complex. But we're still in the realm of inference and suggestion rather than definitive proof. What's clear is that by 1 million years ago, the relationship between humans and fire had moved far beyond simple avoidance or opportunistic scavenging. Fire was becoming integrated into human behaviour in ways that suggest it was no longer feared as an external threat but valued as a predictable resource. This transformation from fire as danger to fire as opportunity may represent one of the most significant cognitive shifts in human evolution. It required our ancestors to overcome millions of years of instinctive fear, to see past the immediate threat of burning to the longer-term benefits that fire could provide. The archaeological record from this period gives us glimpses of humans who were learning to think in fire's terms, to plan around its presence, to organise their activities in ways that maximised its benefits while minimising its risks. They were becoming, in essence, fire's partners rather than its victims. But partnership is not the same as mastery. And as our story continues, we'll see that the line between working with fire and truly controlling it would prove to be one of the most difficult thresholds our species would ever cross. The flame that had been teaching us for millions of years was about to become our student. But that transformation would require leaps of understanding, technological innovation, and cultural transmission that were still thousands of years in the future. For now, in this ancient landscape of opportunity and danger, our ancestors were content to be fire's apprentices, learning its lessons one burn at a time, slowly building the knowledge that would eventually let them reach into the darkness and kindle their own light. The real mastery was still coming, but the foundation was being laid, ember by ember, in the patient observation of a species that had learned that sometimes the most dangerous things were also the most valuable. But sometimes the most important discoveries happen in the most unlikely places. Deep beneath the surface of South Africa, in a cave system so narrow that modern humans need specialized equipment just to squeeze through the passages, something extraordinary was waiting to be found. The Rising Star cave system had been hiding its secrets for hundreds of thousands of years. When researchers finally reached the deepest chambers in the early 21st century, they expected to find fossils. What they didn't expect was evidence that would completely upend our understanding of which species first learned to control fire. The bones belonged to Homo naledi, a hominin with a brain roughly 1/3 the size of ours, curved fingers better suited for climbing than tool making, and a mix of primitive and modern features that made it difficult to classify. By every measure we typically use to assess cognitive capability, Homo naledi shouldn't have been capable of sophisticated fire use. But there, painted across the cave walls and ceilings, in the deepest, most inaccessible chambers, was soot. Fine, powdery carbon residue that could only have come from controlled burning. Alongside it, researchers found animal bones bearing the telltale signs of heat exposure. Not the random charring of a wildfire, but the systematic evidence of flames that had been brought into spaces where no natural fire could ever reach. This discovery forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth about intelligence and fire. We've long assumed that brain size correlates with technological sophistication, that complex behaviours require modern cognitive architecture. But the evidence from Rising Star suggests that the relationship between fire and consciousness might be far more mysterious than we thought. Think about what it would take to bring fire into those caves. The passages are treacherous, even with modern lighting and safety equipment. Homo naledi would have had to navigate in total darkness, carrying embers or burning materials through spaces barely wide enough for their bodies, all while keeping the flames alive in an environment with limited airflow. This isn't opportunistic fire use. This isn't even simple fire maintenance. This is fire transportation and management at a level that suggests deep understanding of combustion principles, oxygen requirements, fuel conservation, heat regulation, all accomplished by a species with a brain the size of an orange. The implications ripple outward from those sooty cave walls. If Homo naledi could control fire, then fire mastery might not be the exclusive achievement of large-brained hominins. It might be a capability that emerged multiple times in different lineages through different pathways of understanding. But Naledi's story also highlights something else crucial about early fire use: the importance of preservation. Making fire is one challenge. Keeping it alive is another entirely. For a species that couldn't reliably create sparks from scratch, the ability to transport and maintain existing flames would have been absolutely critical. We often romanticize fire making as a moment of sudden inspiration. The first spark struck from flint, the first flame coaxed from tinder. But the archaeological record suggests that fire preservation may have been humanity's first and most important relationship with combustion. Ethnographic studies of modern hunter-gatherer societies show us how this might have worked. Among groups that still maintain traditional fire practices, keeping flames alive during travel is often more valued than the ability to start new fires. Embers can be carried in specially prepared bundles of slow-burning material, dried dung, certain fungi, carefully selected bark, that smoulder for hours or even days without bursting into open flame. This kind of fire curation requires intimate knowledge of combustion. You need to understand which materials burn slowly, how to regulate airflow, how to feed the embers just enough to keep them alive without consuming your fuel supply. It's a delicate balance that demands patience, attention, and the kind of practical wisdom that only comes from a repeated experience. The archaeological evidence for this kind of fire preservation is necessarily subtle. Unlike permanent hearths or tool-making debris, carried fire leaves almost no trace unless something goes wrong, unless the bundle catches fully alight, or the embers are deliberately fed into a larger fire that then leaves ash and charcoal for us to find. This invisibility in the archaeological record may explain one of the great puzzles of early fire research: the long periods where fire seems to disappear entirely from human sights, only to reappear later with no obvious technological advance to explain its return. These gaps might not represent the loss of fire knowledge, but rather changes in how fire was being used and maintained. Mobile populations carrying preserved embers would leave very different archaeological signatures than settled groups building permanent hearths. At sites like Kizim Cave in Israel, dating to around 400,000 years ago, we begin to see evidence of this transition from fire preservation to fire production. Here, in a limestone chamber that served as home to early humans for tens of thousands of years, archaeologists found something unprecedented: a permanent hearth. Not just evidence of burning, but a structured fire pit that was used again and again, its ash layers building up over millennia of repeated use. The spatial organisation around this hearth tells a story of humans who are no longer just carrying fire from place to place, but creating dedicated spaces for it to live. The hearth at Kessem is roughly 2 meters wide, positioned near the center of the cave, surrounded by the debris of daily life. Stone tools, butchered bones, sleeping areas. This wasn't just a cooking fire or a source of warmth. It was the organizing principle around which an entire community structured its activities. What makes Kessem even more remarkable is the sophistication of the fire management it reveals. The hearth shows evidence of temperature control, with different zones used for different activities. Some areas were kept at lower temperatures for extended cooking or tool preparation, while others reached the high heats needed for more intensive processing. This level of fire control represents a quantum leap in human technological capability. To maintain different temperature zones within a single hearth requires understanding not just of combustion basics, but of airflow management, fuel selection, and spatial organization. It's evidence of humans who had moved from being fire students to being its teachers. But even this sophisticated fire use might still fall short of true fire creation. The inhabitants of Chasem may have been expert fire managers. Without necessarily being fire makers, they could have been maintaining flames that originated elsewhere, keeping them alive through careful tending and strategic fuel management. The distinction becomes crucial when we consider the psychological and cultural implications of fire mastery. A group that depends on finding or borrowing fire lives under a constant constraint. Their movements are limited by the need to stay near fire sources. Their planning is constrained by the risk of flame failure. Their independence is compromised by dependence on external ignition. A group that can create fire on demand operates under entirely different rules. They can venture into previously inaccessible territories, survive in harsher climates, and organize their activities around internal rather than external schedules. They have crossed from being fire's partners to being its masters. The archaeological evidence for this final threshold, the transition from fire management to fire creation, is maddeningly elusive. The tools and techniques for making fire from scratch are often organic materials that rarely preserve: friction sticks, tinder bundles, dried moss and bark. Even when they do survive, they can be difficult to distinguish from other wooden implements. What we can see are the downstream effects of fire mastery: the expansion of human populations into previously uninhabitable regions, the development of more sophisticated tool technologies that require controlled heating, the emergence of cooking practices that demand reliable access to flame. By 200,000 years ago, anatomically modern humans were appearing across Africa, carrying with them tool traditions and behavioural patterns that suggest a mature relationship with fire. Not just as an occasional resource, but as a fundamental component of human technology and culture. Yet even here, at the threshold of our own species' emergence, the question of fire mastery remains tantalizingly unresolved. We see the effects of controlled fire use everywhere in the archaeological record, but we still can't point to definitive evidence of the techniques used to create it. Perhaps this invisibility is itself significant. True fire mastery might be defined not by the tools used to create flame, but by the confidence to live without constantly worrying about losing it. A species that can reliably make fire whenever needed doesn't need to invest heavily in preservation techniques or backup systems. The absence of elaborate fire-starting kits in the archaeological record might actually be evidence of mastery rather than limitation. When you know you can always make more fire, you don't need to carry it with you everywhere you go. This interpretation aligns with what we see in the broader pattern of human expansion during this period. Groups were venturing into new environments with apparent confidence, establishing themselves in regions where fire would have been essential for survival. This kind of expansion suggests not just fire use, but fire mastery, the psychological security that comes from knowing you can create warmth and light whenever circumstances demand. The story of fire and early humanity is ultimately a story about the relationship between knowledge and confidence, between understanding and independence. Our ancestors spent millions of years learning fire's lessons, studying its patterns, and gradually building the expertise that would eventually free them from dependence on natural ignition. But mastery, when it finally came, may have been less about dramatic technological breakthroughs and more about the accumulated wisdom of generations. The ability to read weather patterns and predict when conditions would be right for fire making. The knowledge of which materials worked best in different circumstances. The patience to experiment and the memory to preserve successful techniques. Fire didn't make us human in a single moment of inspiration. Instead, it taught us how to become human gradually, patiently, through millions of years of careful observation and gradual understanding. And in the end, perhaps that slow education was more valuable than any sudden revelation could have been. The flame that our ancestors first encountered as a wild, dangerous force had become something else entirely. Not just a tool, but a partner in the great human experiment of reshaping the world through knowledge, patience, and the quiet confidence that comes from truly understanding the forces that surround us. But fire's greatest test wasn't in the caves of South Africa or the hearths of ancient Israel. It was in the bitter cold of places where humans had no business surviving at all. Around 1.8 million years ago, something extraordinary happened that would challenge everything we thought we knew about early fire mastery. At a small hill in the Republic of Georgia called Dmanisi, archaeologists uncovered the remains of some of the earliest humans to venture outside Africa. These weren't the robust, large-brained hominins we might expect to find pioneering new continents. They were small, with cranial capacities barely larger than their African predecessors, carrying simple stone tools that wouldn't look out of place a million years earlier. And here's the thing that should make us pause. There's no evidence they had fire. The Dmanisi fossils paint a picture of early Homo erectus populations living at the edge of what should have been possible. Winters in the Caucasus weren't Arctic, but they were cold enough to kill an unprepared primate. Yet somehow, these early humans not only survived, they thrived long enough to leave behind multiple generations of remains. How do you survive winter without fire? The question haunts every theory about early human expansion. These populations had no evidence of tailored clothing, no permanent shelters, no clear heating technology. What they had was something harder to quantify. Behavioural flexibility, social cooperation, and perhaps most importantly, the kind of physiological resilience that comes from living right at the edge of survival. Modern humans often assume that technology saved us, that our tools and techniques lifted us above the constraints of biology. But Dmanisi suggests a different story, that sometimes survival is less about mastering the environment and more about learning to endure what you cannot control. These early migrants may have used strategies we can barely detect in the archaeological record. Animal hide draped over the body for insulation, shared body warmth during cold nights, seasonal migration patterns that followed the availability of resources. Natural shelter in caves and overhangs, supplemented by temporary windbreaks made from branches and stones. The absence of fire at Dmanisi doesn't necessarily mean these populations couldn't use it when available. They may have been opportunistic fire users, taking advantage of natural blazes when they occurred, but not dependent enough on flame to be stopped by its absence. In a sense, they were living proof that fire, for all its importance to later human development, wasn't initially essential for survival in marginal environments. This pattern of expansion without obvious fire mastery appears at other early sites across Eurasia. At Happisburgh in England, human footprints preserved in ancient mud tell us someone was walking along what are now the British coasts nearly 1 million years ago. The climate was milder then, but still challenging for a species evolved in tropical Africa. Yet again, clear evidence of fire use is absent from the archaeological record. The silence around fire during these early expansions raises profound questions about what we mean by human adaptability. Were these populations somehow more resilient than their descendants? Had they developed survival strategies that didn't require controlled combustion? Or were they simply accepting higher levels of risk, pushing into new territories with the knowledge that some groups would fail while others might succeed? Perhaps the most unsettling possibility is that these early humans possessed fire knowledge that we simply can't detect. Fire use that was too temporary, too mobile, or too organic to leave clear archaeological signatures. Techniques for maintaining small, contained fires that consumed their own evidence. Methods of heat generation that didn't rely on permanent hearths or durable fuel sources. The more we study early human expansion, the more we realize that absence of evidence isn't necessarily evidence of absence. The archaeological record is biased toward preservation of durable materials in stable environments. Temporary campsites, mobile technologies, and organic tools tend to vanish without a trace, leaving us to infer behavior from the fragments that happen to survive. This interpretive challenge becomes even more complex when we consider the role of climate change in early human movements. The periods of expansion into Eurasia often coincide with warmer interglacial phases, when northern latitudes would have been more hospitable and migration routes more accessible. During these windows of opportunity, fire might have been useful but not essential for survival. But then the climate would shift again, ice ages would return, temperatures would drop, and the populations that had spread during warmer periods would face a stark choice: adapt in place, retreat to more hospitable regions, or disappear entirely. The archaeological record suggests all three outcomes occurred, sometimes simultaneously in different populations. This creates a pattern we see repeated throughout early human prehistory: expansion during favourable conditions, followed by contraction or extinction when environments became challenging. Fire, when it appears consistently in the record, seems to correlate with populations that could maintain their range even during difficult periods. The first clear, unambiguous evidence of controlled fire use in Eurasia doesn't appear until much later than the initial human expansions. Sites like Schöningen in Germany, with their fire-hardened wooden spears, date to around 400,000 years ago, more than 1 million years after humans first reached Europe. This temporal gap suggests that fire mastery wasn't the key that unlocked human global expansion. Instead, it may have been the innovation that allowed populations to consolidate their gains, to survive in place rather than constantly retreating when conditions deteriorated. The distinction is crucial for understanding how technology relates to human success. We often think of innovations as enabling expansion, as tools that open new possibilities. But fire might be better understood as a stabilizing technology, one that allowed populations to persist in environments they had already reached through other means. This reframing changes how we think about early human capabilities. Instead of viewing pre-fire populations as somehow limited or primitive, we might see them as remarkably adaptable, capable of surviving in conditions that would challenge even modern humans equipped with advanced technology. The Dmanisi populations, living without fire in the shadow of the Caucasus Mountains, weren't failing to achieve some technological milestone. They were succeeding at one of the most difficult challenges any species can face, establishing viable populations in entirely new environments using only their inherited biological and behavioral toolkit. Their success suggests that human adaptability runs deeper than technology, that our species' greatest strength might not be our ability to create tools, but our capacity to survive without them when necessary. Fire, for all its eventual importance, was perhaps less a prerequisite for human expansion than a luxury that later became essential. This perspective helps explain one of the more puzzling patterns in early human archaeology: the repeated appearance and disappearance of fire evidence across different sites and time periods. If fire use was truly essential for survival, we might expect to see it consistently once it appeared. Instead, the record shows a more intermittent pattern, with clear evidence at some sites and mysterious absences at others. Rather than interpreting these gaps as technological setbacks or cultural losses, we might see them as evidence of flexible strategies. Populations using fire when conditions favoured it, but capable of reverting to non-fire survival methods when necessary. This kind of behavioural flexibility would have been enormously valuable during periods of environmental uncertainty. The archaeological evidence from sites like Boxgrove in England supports this interpretation. Here, around 500,000 years ago, we find sophisticated tool-making, organised hunting activities and complex butchery practices, but fire evidence remains ambiguous. These populations were clearly capable of elaborate planning and execution, yet they seem to have been operating without reliable access to controlled flame. What emerges from these early European sites is a picture of human populations that were technologically sophisticated in some domains, while remaining apparently primitive in others. They could coordinate group hunts of large animals, manufacture specialised tools, and process carcasses with remarkable efficiency. But they may have been doing all of this without the benefit of fire for cooking, warmth, or protection. This mosaic of capabilities challenges our linear models of human technological development. We expect innovations to build upon each other, creating cumulative advances toward greater complexity. But early human populations seem to have developed unevenly, achieving mastery in some areas while remaining dependent on older strategies in others. Fire, when it finally appears consistently in the European record, doesn't seem to trigger immediate advances in other technologies. Instead, it seems to provide stability, allowing populations to maintain behaviours they had already developed rather than enabling entirely new ones. The real revolution may have been not technological, but demographic. Fire allowed human populations to persist through environmental fluctuations that had previously caused local extinctions. It provided a buffer against climate variability, enabling groups to maintain knowledge and cultural practices across generations rather than constantly starting over. This buffering effect would have had profound implications for the accumulation of human knowledge. Populations that could survive climate downturns would have more opportunities to refine their techniques, to experiment with new approaches, and to pass knowledge to subsequent generations. Fire might have been less important for what it allowed humans to do than for what it allowed them to remember. In this interpretation, The mastery of fire marks not the beginning of human technological sophistication, but the point at which that sophistication could become cumulative rather than episodic. The flame that our ancestors finally learned to control didn't just warm their bodies, it warmed their culture, keeping the ember of human knowledge alive through the long winters of prehistory. But even this achievement would prove fragile. As we'll see, the relationship between fire and human survival remained precarious for hundreds of thousands of years, with populations repeatedly discovering and losing the ability to create and maintain flame. True mastery, when it came, would require not just technological innovation, but cultural transmission, the ability to pass fire knowledge reliably from one generation to the next. The small, cold populations at Dmanisi couldn't have known they were participating in one of the greatest experiments in the history of life on Earth. They were simply trying to survive another winter, to find enough food for another day, to keep their children alive long enough to become parents themselves. But in their quiet persistence, in their willingness to endure hardship without the tools we consider essential, they were proving something profound about human nature. That our greatest strength might not be our technology, but our refusal to quit. That sometimes the most important innovations are not the tools we create, but the limitations we learn to live without. The fire would come later, but the spark of human determination, that was already burning bright. But fire, when it finally began to appear with regularity in the archaeological record, didn't arrive with fanfare. It crept in quietly, almost invisibly, leaving traces so subtle that archaeologists are still debating what they mean. Around 800,000 years ago, at a marshy site in what is now Germany, something remarkable was taking shape. The Schöningen excavations would eventually yield some of the most extraordinary artifacts from the entire Paleolithic period. Wooden spears, perfectly balanced and aerodynamically sound, preserved in waterlogged sediments that had protected them from decay for nearly 1 million years. But here's what makes these spears truly revolutionary. They had been deliberately hardened with fire. The evidence is written in the wood itself. Microscopic analysis reveals that the spear tips had been exposed to controlled heat, their cellular structure altered in ways that only sustained burning could achieve. This wasn't accidental charring from a wildfire. Someone had held these wooden points in flame, rotating them carefully, hardening the tips to create weapons that were both sharper and more durable than raw wood could ever be. Think about what this represents in terms of cognitive development. Fire hardening wood requires understanding not just that heat changes material properties, but how much heat, applied for how long, will produce the desired result. Too little heat and nothing changes. Too much and the wood becomes brittle and breaks. The sweet spot requires experimentation, memory, and the kind of patient observation that suggests these early humans were thinking several steps ahead. The Schöningen spears also tell us something else crucial about early fire use. It was becoming integrated into complex technological processes. This wasn't just fire for warmth or protection anymore. This was fire as a manufacturing tool, a way of improving materials to create better implements. Archaeological evidence from the same period begins to show similar patterns of technological fire use across Europe and Africa. At sites like Beech's Pit in England, researchers found evidence of controlled burning in contexts that suggest systematic material processing rather than simple hearth maintenance. The sophistication implied by these finds forces us to reconsider our timeline of fire mastery. Populations capable of fire-hardening spear points had clearly moved far beyond opportunistic fire use. They understood combustion well enough to control temperature and duration with precision. They could sustain fires long enough to complete multi-stage manufacturing processes. Yet we still find no clear evidence of fire-starting tools from this period. No friction sticks, no strike stones, no obvious ignition technology. This paradox suggests that even these sophisticated fire users might still have been dependent on external sources of ignition, lightning strikes, natural fires, or flames borrowed from other groups. The implications are profound. Advanced fire manipulation without reliable fire creation would have created a peculiar form of technological dependence. Groups would have been capable of remarkable feats of material processing, but only when they could access existing fires. Their technological capabilities would have been constrained not by knowledge or skill, but by the availability of ignition sources. This constraint might explain some of the puzzling patterns we see in the archaeological record from this period. Sites with clear evidence of sophisticated fire use are often separated by long gaps in the record, as if advanced fire technologies appeared and disappeared unpredictably across the landscape. Rather than technological regression, these gaps might represent the natural consequences of fire-dependent populations. When external ignition sources became scarce, during wet seasons, in certain geographic regions, or simply due to bad luck, even the most fire-sophisticated groups might have been forced to revert to non-fire survival strategies. The psychological impact of this kind of technological dependence would have been enormous. Imagine being capable of creating superior tools and processed foods, but only when conditions allowed. The frustration of knowing how to improve your circumstances, but being unable to do so consistently, would have created powerful incentives for solving the ignition problem. This may be why the eventual development of reliable fire-making techniques was so transformative. It wasn't just about adding a new capability to the human toolkit. It was about freeing existing capabilities from external constraints. The transition from fire dependence to fire independence is one of the most difficult thresholds to track archaeologically. The tools and techniques for making fire from scratch are often organic materials that rarely preserve, tinder bundles of dried grass or bark, friction sticks worn smooth by use, carefully prepared, spark-catching materials. Even when these materials do survive, they can be difficult to distinguish from other organic implements. A piece of charred wood might be evidence of fire-making technology, or it might simply be the remains of fuel that was burned for warmth. The ambiguity in the archaeological record reflects the subtle nature of the technologies involved. What we can track are the downstream effects of reliable fire creation, the expansion of human populations into previously marginal environments, the development of cooking techniques that require sustained, controlled heat, the emergence of more complex tool technologies that depend on thermal processing. By 400,000 years ago, these effects begin to appear with increasing frequency in the archaeological record. Sites like Kesem Cave in Israel show evidence of organized hearths that were used continuously for tens of thousands of years. The spatial organization around these fires suggests not just fire use, but fire planning, the kind of long-term thinking that comes from confidence in your ability to maintain flame indefinitely. The hearths at Kesem reveal something else remarkable: evidence of temperature control within a single fire. Different zones of the hearth were maintained at different heat levels, suggesting that the inhabitants understood not just how to make fire, but how to manipulate it for specific purposes. Low temperature zones were used for slow cooking and material processing. Higher temperature areas were reserved for tasks requiring intense heat. This kind of fire management represents a quantum leap in thermal sophistication, moving from simple flame maintenance to complex heat engineering. The implications extend far beyond cooking. Controlled temperature manipulation opens the door to entirely new categories of material processing. Stone heat treatment, which improves the flaking properties of certain rocks, becomes possible. Wood seasoning and preservation techniques emerge. Even early forms of chemical processing, extracting resins, preparing adhesives, creating pigments, become feasible with reliable temperature control. But perhaps most importantly, sophisticated fire management creates the foundation for knowledge transmission. Complex fire techniques can't be learned through casual observation. They require instruction, practice, and correction. The emergence of advanced fire technologies may mark the point at which human culture became truly cumulative, where knowledge began to build systematically across generations rather than being rediscovered repeatedly by isolated groups. The archaeological evidence for this cultural transmission is necessarily indirect. We can't observe prehistoric teaching sessions or document the flow of knowledge between generations, but we can see the results in the increasing standardization and sophistication of fire-related technologies across wide geographic ranges. Similar hearth construction techniques appear at sites separated by thousands of kilometers. Comparable approaches to temperature control emerge independently in different regions. The patterns suggest not just parallel innovation, but active knowledge sharing, trade routes for ideas, as well as materials. This cultural dimension of fire mastery may be more important than the technological aspects. The ability to create fire on demand was certainly valuable, but the ability to teach fire creation reliably was revolutionary. It transformed fire from a rare and precious resource into a reproducible technology that could spread and evolve. The transmission of fire knowledge also created new forms of social organization. Fire masters, individuals with particular expertise in ignition techniques or thermal processing, may have occupied special roles within their communities. Their knowledge would have been valuable enough to support specialization, freeing them from other subsistence activities to focus on perfecting and teaching fire-related skills. This specialization, in turn, would have accelerated technological development. Dedicated fire specialists could experiment with new techniques, refine existing methods, and push the boundaries of what was possible with controlled combustion. The resulting innovations would have benefited entire communities while further elevating the status of fire masters. Archaeological evidence hints at this kind of specialization in the spatial organization of some sites. Certain areas seem to have been dedicated specifically to fire-related activities, with concentrations of heat-altered materials, specialized tools, and evidence of repeated thermal processing. These zones suggest not just fire use, but fire expertise, spaces where knowledge was concentrated and transmitted. The emergence of fire specialization may also explain why reliable ignition techniques, when they finally appeared, spread so rapidly across human populations. Unlike other technologies that might offer only marginal benefits, fire creation was immediately and obviously valuable to any group that encountered it. The knowledge would have been actively sought out, traded for, and copied whenever possible. Groups with fire-making capabilities would have had enormous advantages in establishing trade relationships, forming alliances, and expanding into new territories. The technology would have been under constant pressure to spread and improve, but even as fire mastery was transforming human capabilities, it was also creating new vulnerabilities. Populations that became dependent on fire for survival were at risk if their fire knowledge was lost or their ignition materials were damaged. The benefits of fire came with the responsibility of maintaining and protecting fire-related technologies. This responsibility may have been one of the driving forces behind the development of more reliable and redundant fire-making systems. Groups that could create fire using multiple techniques, or that maintained backup ignition materials, would have been more resilient than those dependent on single methods. The archaeological record from this period shows increasing diversity in fire-related technologies, suggesting that human populations were indeed developing multiple approaches to ignition and thermal control. Rather than converging on a single optimal technique, different groups seem to have specialized in different fire technologies while maintaining awareness of alternative methods. This technological diversity created a kind of cultural insurance policy. If one fire technique failed or was lost, others remained available. Knowledge could be recovered from neighboring groups or redeveloped from first principles. The fire mastery that had become essential for human survival was itself protected by redundancy and cultural exchange. By 200,000 years ago, as anatomically modern humans were beginning to appear across Africa, fire had become so thoroughly integrated into human technology and culture that its absence would have been unthinkable. The archaeological record from this period shows not just fire use, but fire assumption, spatial organization, tool design, and settlement patterns that take reliable access to controlled flame as a given. This represents the completion of a journey that had taken millions of years. From the first cautious observations of wildfire by early hominins to the sophisticated thermal engineering of late Pleistocene populations, the relationship between humans and fire had been utterly transformed. We had moved from being fire's victims to being its students, from students to partners, and finally from partners to masters. The flame that had once been an external force to be feared and avoided had become an extension of human will, a tool as familiar and reliable as our own hands. But mastery, as we were about to discover, would bring its own challenges. The fire that had liberated us from so many constraints was about to create new ones we hadn't anticipated. The story of fire and humanity was far from over. It was entering a new and more complex phase, one where the question wouldn't be whether we could control fire, but whether we could control ourselves in a world where fire obeyed our every command. The ember of human ambition was about to become a conflagration, and like our ancestors watching their first wildfire, we would learn that some forces, once unleashed, are harder to contain than we ever imagined. The real test of fire mastery wouldn't come in moments of abundance, but in the spaces between, those long stretches when embers died and lightning refused to strike. By 300,000 years ago, as early modern humans began their tentative expansion beyond Africa, they carried with them not just stone tools and cultural knowledge, but something far more precious and perilous: the responsibility of keeping flame alive. Picture a small band of humans crossing the harsh landscapes of the Arabian Peninsula during one of its brief green phases. Their survival kit included everything you might expect: carefully crafted stone points, knowledge of water sources, understanding of seasonal patterns. But hidden among their possessions was something that would have seemed almost magical to their distant ancestors: a carefully tended bundle of smouldering material, protected from wind and rain, fed just enough to keep glowing without bursting into destructive flame. This was fire's inheritance, passed not from parent to child like genes or language, but from ember to ember in an unbroken chain stretching back thousands of generations. Every morning, someone checked the bundle. Every evening, someone fed it fresh material. Every river crossing, every storm, every moment of carelessness could break a lineage of flame that had been maintained longer than anyone could remember. The archaeological evidence for this kind of fire curation is necessarily subtle. At sites like Jebel Irhoud in Morocco and Mislia Cave in Israel, we find the remains of sophisticated fire use, organised hearths, processed foods, heat-altered tools, but little evidence of the ignition technologies that would have created these flames from scratch. This pattern suggests something remarkable: populations with advanced fire management capabilities that may still have been dependent on external sources of ignition. They could do extraordinary things with fire once they had it, but getting it in the first place remained a challenge that required either natural sources or contact with other fire-bearing groups. The psychological implications of this dependence run deeper than simple technological limitation. Imagine planning a journey into unknown territory when your survival depends on maintaining something as fragile as a glowing coal. Every decision about route, timing, and risk would be filtered through the question of fire security. How far can we travel in a day without exhausting our fuel supply? What happens if it rains for a week? Where can we find materials to keep the embers alive? This kind of planning requires not just individual foresight, but collective memory. Someone in the group needs to know which materials burn slowly and steadily. Someone needs to understand how different weather conditions affect ember preservation. Someone needs to remember the locations where suitable fuel has been found before. Archaeological sites from this period show evidence of exactly this kind of collective fire knowledge. At Kizum Cave, layers of ash and burnt bone accumulated over tens of thousands of years in patterns that suggest not random fire use, but systematic application of thermal technologies. Different zones of the cave were used for different fire-related activities, indicating specialization and planning that could only come from deep, culturally transmitted knowledge. But knowledge without reliable ignition remained vulnerable. A single catastrophic loss, a flood, a theft, a moment of inattention, could leave even the most fire-sophisticated group suddenly helpless in the dark. This vulnerability may explain one of the more puzzling patterns in the archaeological record: sites with clear evidence of advanced fire use that are separated by long gaps where fire signatures disappear entirely. Rather than technological regression, these gaps might represent the natural consequence of fire dependence. When external ignition sources failed and preserved embers were lost, even highly sophisticated populations might have been forced to revert to non-fire survival strategies. The pressure to solve the ignition problem would have been enormous. Any technique that could reliably create fire from readily available materials would have offered such obvious advantages that it would have spread rapidly through human populations. The fact that clear evidence for fire-starting technologies appears relatively late in the archaeological record suggests just how difficult this problem was to solve. When solutions finally emerged, they came not as sudden breakthroughs, but as gradual refinements of techniques that had probably been attempted countless times before. The physics of friction fire, using rapid rubbing to generate enough heat for ignition, is not particularly complex, but translating that understanding into reliable practical techniques required generations of experimentation and refinement. The earliest clear evidence for systematic fire creation comes from sites like Schöningen, but even here the technologies remain largely invisible to archaeological detection. Wood-on-wood friction methods leave few durable traces. Tinder bundles of dried grass or bark decompose rapidly. Even stone-on-stone percussion techniques might leave only subtle wear patterns that could be mistaken for other uses. What we can see are the effects of reliable fire creation, the expansion of human populations into previously marginal environments, the development of cooking techniques requiring sustained controlled heat, the emergence of material processing technologies dependent on thermal manipulation. By 200,000 years ago, these effects were becoming visible across Africa and beyond. Sites show not just fire use, but fire confidence, spatial organization, and technological choices that assume reliable access to controlled flame. Hearths were built as permanent features rather than temporary conveniences. Tools were designed with thermal processing in mind. Settlement patterns reflected the security that comes from knowing fire could be created whenever needed. This transition from fire dependence to fire independence may represent one of the most psychologically transformative moments in human evolution. The anxiety of maintaining precious embers was replaced by the confidence of renewable flame. Planning horizons expanded from days to seasons. Risk tolerance increased as the safety net of controllable fire provided security against environmental uncertainty. But independence brought its own challenges. Populations that could create fire on demand faced new questions about when, where, and how much to burn. The restraint that had been imposed by scarcity was suddenly removed, replaced by choices that earlier humans never had to make. Archaeological evidence suggests that these newly fire-independent populations didn't always make optimal decisions. Some sites from this period show evidence of overburning, so much thermal processing that local fuel sources became depleted. Others reveal what appear to be accidental fires that escaped control, leaving behind layers of ash and destruction that tell stories of learning through costly mistakes. The mastery of fire creation may have been less like acquiring a new tool and more like gaining access to a new form of power, one that required not just technical skill, but wisdom about when and how to use it responsibly. This challenge would only intensify as human populations continue to grow and spread. Fire that had once been a rare and precious resource was becoming commonplace, even mundane. The flame that had taught our ancestors patience and reverence was about to become so familiar that we might forget the lessons it had taken millions of years to learn. The next phase of our story would test not our ability to create fire, but our wisdom in living with the consequences of that creation. As we were about to discover, some thresholds once crossed fundamentally change not just what we can do, but who we are. The ember of human ambition was growing brighter. And like our ancestors who first learned to fear the wildfire before they learned to use it, we were about to discover that the most dangerous flames are often the ones we light ourselves. But before we could learn those lessons, we had to finish crossing the threshold that separated fire users from fire masters. That final step, when it came, would be marked not by the grandeur of Prometheus stealing flame from the gods, but by something far more human. The quiet satisfaction of a spark caught in tinder, blown to flame by steady breath, and fed into warmth on a cold night when no other fire burned within 100 miles. The age of fire dependence was ending. The age of fire mastery was about to begin, and with it would come possibilities, responsibilities, and dangers that our fire-carrying ancestors could never have imagined. The flame they had preserved so carefully was about to become something they could create at will. The question was, what would they choose to do with it? The real turning point wasn't marked by celebration or ceremony. It happened quietly, probably on an ordinary morning when someone's carefully tended ember bundle finally died. And instead of panic, there was purpose. Instead of desperation, there was knowledge. Instead of waiting for lightning, there were hands that knew exactly what to do. By 200,000 years ago, scattered across the landscapes of Africa and the expanding edges of human territory, our ancestors were crossing one of the most significant thresholds in our species' history, not the threshold between animal and human that had been crossed long before. This was the threshold between dependence and independence, between borrowing fire and creating it, between living at nature's mercy and bending nature to human will. But like most revolutionary moments in human history, it probably felt mundane to those living through it. No one woke up one morning and declared, "Today I will master fire." Instead, someone who had spent years observing the properties of different woods, the effects of friction and pressure, the behaviour of sparks and tinder, simply put that knowledge to use when circumstances demanded it. The archaeological record from this period tells us that something fundamental was changing in how humans related to fire. Sites begin to show evidence not just of sophisticated fire use, but of fire assumption, spatial planning, tool design, and settlement patterns that take reliable access to controlled flame as a given. At Pinnacle Point in South Africa, researchers found something that would have been impossible without complete confidence in fire availability: evidence of systematic heat treatment of stone tools. The inhabitants weren't just using fire to cook food or provide warmth, they were employing it as a precision manufacturing technology, heating silkrete rocks to temperatures that improved their flaking properties and made them easier to shape into superior tools. This kind of thermal engineering requires more than casual fire use. It demands understanding of temperature control, timing, and material properties. You need to know not just how to make fire, but how to make exactly the right amount of fire at exactly the right temperature for exactly the right duration. That's the signature of true mastery. The process of heat treating stone tools reveals the depth of knowledge these early humans had accumulated. Silkrete needs to be heated gradually to between 300 and 400 degrees Celsius, then held at that temperature for hours. Too fast and the stone cracks. Too cool and nothing changes. Too hot and the material becomes brittle and unusable. Experimental archaeology has shown that achieving these precise conditions requires careful fuel selection, airflow management, and constant attention. It's not something you can accomplish with a casual campfire or an opportunistically maintained ember bundle. It requires fire that you can create, control, and sustain according to your needs, rather than nature's availability. The implications ripple outward from those heat-treated stones. Populations capable of this kind of thermal precision had moved far beyond the constraints that had limited their ancestors. They weren't planning their movements around fire availability or limiting their technological ambitions to what existing flames could provide. They were making fire serve their purposes rather than serving fire's demands. Archaeological sites from this period begin to show the effects of this liberation. Human populations were expanding into environments that would have been challenging or impossible without reliable fire access. Mountain regions with cold nights, desert areas where fuel was scarce, coastal zones where wet conditions made fire maintenance difficult, all were becoming accessible to groups that could create warmth and light on demand. The expansion wasn't just geographical, it was cognitive and cultural. Cooking techniques became more sophisticated when cooks could count on having the right heat at the right time. Tool making evolved beyond what cold stone could provide. Social organization shifted as groups no longer needed to organize their daily routines around the maintenance of precious embers. But perhaps most importantly, knowledge transmission accelerated. Complex fire techniques that had once been jealously guarded secrets became teachable skills. When fire creation was reliable, fire knowledge could be shared more freely. Teachers could demonstrate techniques without risking their group's survival if something went wrong during the lesson. Evidence for this cultural acceleration appears in the increasing standardization of fire-related technologies across wide geographic ranges. Similar hearth construction methods emerge at sites separated by thousands of kilometers. Comparable approaches to temperature control develop independently in different regions. The patterns suggest not just parallel innovation, but active knowledge sharing, networks of cultural transmission that were spreading fire mastery faster than populations could migrate. Yet even as fire mastery was transforming human capabilities, it was creating new challenges that earlier generations had never faced. Populations that could create fire at will had to develop wisdom about when, where, and how much to burn. The restraint imposed by scarcity was replaced by choices that required judgment, foresight, and sometimes difficult decisions about resource management. Archaeological evidence from this period includes some of the first clear examples of fire-related environmental impact. Sites show evidence of overburning, so much thermal processing that local fuel sources became depleted. Others reveal what appear to be accidental fires that escaped control, leaving behind layers of ash and charcoal that speak to learning through costly mistakes. These failures weren't setbacks, they were education. Each mistake taught lessons about fire behavior, fuel management, and environmental consequences. Populations that learned from these experiences developed more sophisticated approaches to fire use, while those that didn't faced resource depletion and possible local extinction. The development of fire wisdom, the knowledge of not just how to create fire, but when and why to use it responsibly, may have been as important as the technical mastery itself. Groups that could balance fire's benefits against its costs would have been more successful in the long term than those that simply maximized burning without considering consequences. This balance required new forms of social organization. Fire use decisions couldn't be left to individuals acting on impulse. They needed to be coordinated, planned, and sometimes regulated. The emergence of fire mastery may have been one of the drivers behind more complex human social structures, as groups developed systems for managing a powerful technology that affected everyone's welfare. The archaeological record hints at this social complexity in the spatial organisation around hearths. Rather than random scattering of fire-related activities, sites show evidence of designated areas for different types of burning, suggesting rules or customs about where different fire uses were appropriate. Some zones were reserved for cooking, others for tool processing, still others for heating or light. This kind of spatial regulation implies not just technical knowledge, but social agreements about how that knowledge should be applied. Fire mastery was becoming embedded in culture, not just technology. The transmission of fire wisdom across generations required more than just teaching techniques. It demanded the communication of values, judgment calls, and hard-won insights about balancing immediate benefits against long-term costs. This kind of knowledge couldn't be learned through simple observation or mechanical practice. It required storytelling, discussion, and the kind of reflective thinking that transforms experience into wisdom. Archaeological sites from this period begin to show evidence of spaces that seem designed for gathering and communication, areas around hearths where tools were made, food was shared, and presumably knowledge was transmitted. These weren't just cooking fires or work areas, they were becoming social centres, places where technical skills and cultural values were woven together into the fabric of human community. The hearth was evolving from a technological necessity into a cultural institution. The fire that had once been a tool for survival was becoming a focus for identity, memory, and collective decision-making. Around those flames, human society was learning to regulate itself, to balance individual desires against group needs, to think beyond the immediate demands of survival toward the longer-term requirements of sustainability. By 100,000 years ago, as anatomically modern humans were beginning their major expansion beyond Africa, they carried with them not just the technical ability to create fire, but the cultural wisdom to use it responsibly. The archaeological record from their migration routes shows evidence of sophisticated fire management, controlled burning that enhanced rather than depleted local environments, thermal processing that maximized resource utility without waste, settlement patterns that balanced fire access with fuel conservation. These migrating populations weren't just spreading across the globe, they were carrying with them a new relationship between humans and the elemental forces that shaped their world. Fire had taught them that power and responsibility were inseparable, that mastery meant not just ability, but wisdom, that true control required understanding not just of techniques, but of consequences. The journey from fire fear to fire mastery had taken millions of years and involved countless extinct lineages, failed experiments, and hard-won lessons. But by the time our direct ancestors were ready to populate the world, they had learned something that no previous species had ever achieved: how to partner with one of nature's most powerful forces while remaining aware of its dangers. The flame that had once been their teacher was now their tool. The force that had once constrained their movements was now extending their reach. The fire that had once been borrowed from lightning and wildfire was now theirs to create, control, and command. But mastery, as they were about to discover, would bring challenges that dependence had never posed. The same fire that liberated them from environmental constraints would eventually challenge their wisdom, their restraint, and their ability to think beyond immediate needs toward distant consequences. The age of fire mastery had begun. The age of fire responsibility was just around the corner, and the lessons our ancestors learned during this transition would echo across all the millennia that followed, right down to our own time, when the fires we light are reshaping not just local landscapes, but the climate of the entire planet. The ember they had learned to kindle was about to become a force that would transform not just human society, but the earth itself. Whether that transformation would be creation or destruction would depend on how well they had learned fire's most important lesson, that with great power comes the need for even greater wisdom. The question that haunts every archaeological dig isn't what we've found, it's what we've missed. Because by 50,000 years ago, as our ancestors were spreading across continents, with a confidence that suggests complete fire mastery, something else was happening in the shadows of prehistory. Other human species, other minds, other hands were also reaching for flame, and some of them were getting there first. In the depths of South African caves, in chambers so narrow that modern researchers need specialised equipment just to squeeze through the passages, we found evidence that challenges everything we thought we knew about intelligence and fire. Homo naledi, a species with a brain roughly 1/3 the size of ours, was apparently carrying flames into spaces where no natural fire could ever reach. The soot on those cave walls isn't random. It's systematic, deliberate, the kind of carbon residue that only comes from controlled burning maintained over extended periods. These weren't accidental fires or the remnants of lightning strikes. Someone was bringing flame into the deepest, most inaccessible parts of cave systems, places where even getting there in the dark would have been a feat of navigation and courage. But Naledi's small brain forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth about our assumptions. We've long believed that fire mastery required modern cognitive architecture, that complex thermal technologies were the exclusive domain of large-brained hominins. The evidence from Rising Star Cave suggests we may have been wrong. This discovery opens a troubling possibility that fire mastery wasn't a single achievement by a single lineage, but a threshold that multiple species crossed independently. If Naledi could control fire with a brain the size of a grapefruit, then perhaps the relationship between cognition and combustion is far more mysterious than we ever imagined. The implications ripple beyond simple technological capability. If different human species were independently discovering fire mastery, then the early world may have been far more complex than our models suggest. Instead of a single lineage gradually accumulating fire knowledge, we might be looking at multiple parallel experiments in thermal technology, each developing along different paths towards similar goals. Archaeological evidence supports this interpretation. Across Eurasia and Africa, during the Middle Pleistocene, we find fire signatures at sites associated with different hominin species. Homo erectus, Homo heidelbergensis, possibly even late-surviving archaic populations whose identities remain unclear. Each seems to have developed distinctive approaches to fire management, suggesting not shared knowledge, but independent innovation. At Gerizim Cave in Israel, the permanent hearth that burned for tens of thousands of years shows technical sophistication that rivals anything achieved by early modern humans. Temperature control, spatial organization, fuel management, all executed by populations that may have been only distantly related to our own lineage. In Germany, the fire-hardened spears of Schöningen demonstrate thermal engineering capabilities that require deep understanding of material properties and combustion control. Yet these weapons were crafted by Homo heidelbergensis, a species that diverged from our line hundreds of thousands of years before modern humans appeared. The pattern that emerges is both humbling and unsettling. Fire mastery wasn't the unique achievement of a single clever species gradually accumulating knowledge over time. It was a threshold that multiple forms of human intelligence approached and crossed, each in their own way, each leaving behind evidence of sophisticated thermal technologies. This parallel development of fire mastery creates a profound puzzle about the nature of human intelligence itself. If such diverse cognitive architectures could independently achieve similar technological goals, then perhaps intelligence isn't as linear or hierarchical as we've assumed. Perhaps there are multiple pathways to complex problem solving, multiple ways of understanding and manipulating the physical world. The archaeological record from this period tells a story not of technological competition between human species, but of technological convergence. Different populations, separated by geography and evolutionary history, were arriving at similar solutions to the challenges of fire control. The physics of combustion may have been guiding these independent innovations toward common outcomes. But convergence doesn't mean uniformity. Each species seems to have specialized in different aspects of fire technology. Some excelled at temperature control, others at fuel management, still others at transport and preservation techniques. The diversity of approaches suggests that fire mastery wasn't a single skill, but a complex of related capabilities that could be developed in various combinations. This technological diversity may have been crucial for the long-term success of fire-using populations. Groups that specialized in different fire technologies could potentially learn from each other when their ranges overlapped. Knowledge could flow between species, accelerating innovation and preventing the loss of crucial techniques when individual populations faced extinction. The evidence for such interspecies knowledge transmission remains circumstantial but intriguing. Similar fire management techniques appear at sites associated with different hominin species, suggesting either independent convergent evolution or active cultural exchange. Given the sophistication of these technologies and the benefits they provided, it's plausible that fire knowledge was actively sought out and shared whenever opportunity arose. Contact between fire-using human species may have been more common than we typically imagine. The Middle Pleistocene landscape wasn't divided into neat territorial boundaries, separating different evolutionary lineages. Instead, it was a complex mosaic where different populations overlapped, interacted, and sometimes coexisted for extended periods. Archaeological sites from this era occasionally show evidence of mixed assemblages, tool traditions, and fire technologies that seem to blend elements from different hominin species. These hybrid signatures might represent contact zones where knowledge was exchanged, techniques were shared, and innovations were transmitted across species boundaries. The implications of such exchange are staggering. If fire knowledge was flowing between different human lineages, then the development of thermal technologies may have been a collective human achievement, rather than the accomplishment of any single species. Our own mastery of fire might be built on foundations laid by extinct relatives whose contributions we're only beginning to recognize. This collaborative model of fire development also helps explain some of the puzzling patterns in the archaeological record. The rapid spread of similar fire technologies across vast geographic ranges becomes more comprehensible if knowledge was actively transmitted between groups rather than independently rediscovered in each location. The sudden appearance of sophisticated fire management at sites where simpler technologies had previously dominated makes more sense if we assume that advanced techniques were being introduced by contact with more experienced fire-using populations rather than developed through local innovation alone. Even the periodic disappearance of fire technologies from certain regions becomes less mysterious if we consider the possibility that knowledge was flowing in and out of areas as populations migrated, competed, or cooperated with each other. But this collaborative model also raises troubling questions about what happened to all those other fire-using species. If multiple human lineages had achieved fire mastery, why did only one survive to populate the modern world? What advantages did Homo sapiens possess that allowed them to outlast their fire-using relatives? The answer may have less to do with technological superiority than with demographic and ecological factors. Species that achieved fire mastery but remained confined to specific environments or limited population sizes would have been vulnerable to extinction, regardless of their technical capabilities. Climate change, resource depletion, or simple bad luck could have eliminated entire lineages despite their sophisticated fire technologies. Homo sapiens may have survived not because we were the best fire users, but because we were the most adaptable, the most mobile, or simply the most numerous when environmental pressures intensified during the late Pleistocene. Our fire mastery was certainly important, but it may have been just one factor among many that determined which human species would inherit the Earth. The extinction of our fire-using relatives represents one of the great losses in human history. Each species that mastered fire likely developed unique approaches to thermal technology, distinctive solutions to the challenges of combustion control, specialized knowledge that took thousands of generations to accumulate. When these species disappeared, their fire wisdom disappeared with them. Techniques that might have been more efficient, more sustainable, or more sophisticated than our own were lost forever. The diversity of human approaches to fire mastery was reduced to the single lineage that happened to survive the bottlenecks of the late Pleistocene. Archaeological evidence hints at this lost diversity in the scattered fire signatures of extinct human species. Each shows distinctive characteristics, different hearth construction methods, alternative fuel selection strategies, unique approaches to temperature control. These variations represent experiments in fire technology that we can no longer fully understand or replicate. The soot-stained caves of Homo naledi, the precision-engineered spears of Homo heidelbergensis, the sophisticated hearths of unknown archaic populations, all stand as monuments to roads not taken, to alternative ways of understanding and controlling fire that vanished with the species that created them. As we approach the end of our journey through deep time, we're left with a paradox. The fire mastery that we've inherited from our ancestors was both a unique human achievement and a convergent solution reached by multiple human species. It represents both the triumph of our particular lineage and the tragedy of all the others that didn't make it to the present. The flame that lights our modern world was kindled not by a single moment of inspiration, but by countless experiments, innovations, and discoveries spread across hundreds of thousands of years and multiple human species. We are the inheritors not just of our own ancestors' fire wisdom, but of the collective thermal knowledge of an entire family of extinct relatives whose names we'll never know. In the end, the question isn't whether early humans mastered fire or stole it from nature. The question is whether we've proven worthy inheritors of a gift that was paid for with the extinction of every other human species that once shared our fascination with flame. The fire burns on, but the voices that once sang around it have grown fewer. We are the last human species, the final firekeepers, the only ones left to remember what it cost to bring light to the darkness. And as we face our own challenges with fire, climate change driven by our burning of fossil fuels, wildfires intensified by our alteration of natural systems, the need to balance thermal technology with environmental responsibility, we might do well to remember that we're not just carrying on our own traditions, but honouring the memory of all the other human hands that once reached for flame in the ancient night. The story of fire and humanity isn't finished. It's still being written in every spark we strike, every flame we kindle, every choice we make about when to burn and when to conserve. The ancestors who taught us to master fire also taught us that with that mastery comes responsibility, not just to ourselves, but to the world that provided the fuel, the oxygen, and the spark that made it all possible. The fire that began as nature's wild force, that became humanity's shared achievement, now rests in our hands alone. What we do with it will determine not just our own future, but the future of the planet that gave birth to both fire and the curious apes who learned to call it their own. That's where we'll pause tonight. Bored people? Next time, we'll explore what happened when fire mastery met agriculture, when settled civilizations began reshaping entire landscapes with flame, and when the controlled burning that had sustained our ancestors for millennia began to transform into something larger, more powerful, and ultimately more dangerous than anyone could have imagined. Until then, the next time you light a match or kindle a fire, remember, you're participating in a ritual that stretches back through millions of years, connects you to dozens of extinct human species, and carries forward the accumulated wisdom of countless generations who learned, one spark at a time, how to bring light to the darkness. The flame in your hand isn't just yours. It belongs to all of us who ever reached for fire, and all of us who ever will. But what happens when the masters become the mastered? When the species that learn to kindle flame at will discovers that fire has its own agenda, one that extends far beyond the cosy boundaries of hearths and hunting camps. By 50,000 years ago, something had shifted in the relationship between humans and fire. We weren't just creating it anymore. We were beginning to reshape entire landscapes with it. The archaeological record from this period tells a story that should make us uncomfortable, because it's a story we're still living today. Across Australia, which humans had reached by at least 65,000 years ago, the pollen record reveals a dramatic transformation. Ancient lake sediments show a sudden shift in vegetation patterns, fire-sensitive rainforest species declining rapidly, replaced by fire-tolerant eucalyptus and grasslands. The timing coincides almost exactly with human arrival. This wasn't accidental. Archaeological sites across the continent show evidence of systematic landscape burning, controlled fires set not for cooking or warmth, but for ecological management. Our ancestors had discovered that fire could be used not just to process materials, but to process entire environments. The technique, which Australian Aboriginal peoples would perfect and maintain for tens of thousands of years, involved burning small sections of landscape during specific seasons, creating a mosaic of different vegetation stages. Fresh growth attracted game animals. Cleared areas were easier to travel through. Certain plants produced better seeds or tubers after controlled burning. But this wasn't the gentle, sustainable fire management we might imagine from our modern perspective. The initial transformation was dramatic, even catastrophic. Within a few thousand years of human arrival, Australia lost most of its megafauna. Giant kangaroos, massive wombats, predatory marsupial lions. The connection to human fire use isn't proven, but the timing is suggestive. Similar patterns emerge wherever humans spread during this period. In North America, which was populated sometime before 15,000 years ago, the arrival of humans again coincides with major ecological disruptions. Massive mammals that had survived multiple ice ages suddenly vanished. Forests gave way to grasslands. Lake sediments show increased charcoal levels, suggesting more frequent burning. The traditional explanation for these extinctions focuses on hunting, humans as super predators driving megafauna to extinction through overhunting. But increasingly, researchers are recognizing fire as an equally important factor. Landscape burning would have destroyed the specific vegetation communities that many large herbivores depended on. Even without direct hunting pressure, habitat transformation alone could have pushed species beyond their survival threshold. This represents a crucial turning point in our story. For millions of years, fire had been teaching humans restraint, patience, careful observation of natural rhythms. But once we achieved true mastery, the ability to create fire at will, in any quantity, whenever we wanted, those lessons became optional rather than mandatory. Archaeological evidence from this period shows increasing boldness in fire use. Sites reveal evidence of massive burns, fuel consumption on scales that would have been impossible for earlier fire-dependent populations. The restraint imposed by scarcity was gone, replaced by the intoxication of unlimited power. But power without wisdom creates problems, and the problems were beginning to accumulate. Pollen records from human-occupied regions show signs of what ecologists call landscape simplification. Diverse plant communities replaced by monotonous fire-adapted species. Soil chemistry changes in ways that suggest intensive burning was depleting nutrients faster than natural cycles could replace them. Yet our ancestors adapted. They had to. When you've burned through the easily available fuel, you learn to manage what remains more carefully. Archaeological sites from this later period show evidence of more sophisticated fire management strategies, controlled burns on specific schedules, protection of seed trees to ensure forest regeneration, rotation systems that allowed depleted areas to recover. The Aboriginal Australian fire management systems that Europeans encountered in the 18th century represent the mature development of these techniques. Tens of thousands of years of trial and error had produced methods of landscape burning that were both productive and sustainable. But that wisdom came at a cost: the loss of the original ecosystems that had taken millions of years to evolve. The pattern would repeat itself wherever humans spread. Initial ecological disruption, as fire mastery was applied without restraint, followed by the gradual development of more sustainable practices as populations learned to live within the constraints of their altered environments. But there's something unsettling about this progression. Each time humans entered a new continent, they seem to have made the same mistakes: overburning, ecosystem disruption, species extinctions, followed by gradual adaptation to degraded conditions. Why didn't the lessons learned in one place transfer to new environments? Part of the answer may be demographic. The populations that spread across the globe were often small groups separated by vast distances and long time periods. Knowledge that had been accumulated in one region couldn't easily be transmitted to migrants entering entirely different ecosystems thousands of years later. Yeah, but there's a deeper issue at play. Fire mastery seems to create a kind of cognitive bias, a tendency to see fire as a universal solution to environmental challenges. When you have a powerful tool, every problem starts to look like something that tool can solve. The restraint and ecological awareness that had been forced on earlier fire-dependent populations was gradually lost as fire became commonplace. Archaeological sites from the late Pleistocene show evidence of this bias in action. Repeated burning of the same areas long after they had ceased to be productive. Fuel consumption patterns that suggest quantity was prioritized over sustainability. Settlement patterns that relied on continuous landscape modification rather than adaptation to existing conditions. The psychological transformation that accompanied fire mastery may have been as significant as the technological one. Populations that could create fire at will began to see themselves differently, not as participants in natural cycles, but as managers of them. The humility that came from dependence on natural fire sources was replaced by the confidence of technological control. This shift in mindset had profound implications for human relationships with other species and ecosystems. Animals that had co-evolved with natural fire cycles found themselves facing human-controlled burning regimes that followed different rules and schedules. Plants that had adapted to lightning-sparked fires encountered human-set blazes that burned at different intensities and frequencies. The result was a cascade of evolutionary pressures that reshaped biological communities wherever humans established themselves. Species that could adapt to human fire management survived and sometimes thrived. Those that couldn't were pushed toward extinction or marginal habitats. Archaeological evidence suggests that our ancestors were aware of these effects, at least to some degree. Sites show evidence of deliberate conservation practices, protection of certain tree species, maintenance of refuge areas where sensitive plants and animals could persist, rotation systems that prevented total habitat destruction. But awareness didn't necessarily translate into restraint. The same sites that show conservation practices also show evidence of continued intensive burning. The knowledge was there, but the incentives to apply it consistently may have been lacking. This tension between knowledge and application would become a recurring theme in human fire use. We've always been capable of understanding fire's ecological impacts. The question has been whether we've been willing to modify our behaviour based on that understanding when doing so conflicts with short-term benefits. The archaeological record from the late Pleistocene suggests that our ancestors struggled with this same dilemma. They developed sophisticated fire management techniques, but they didn't always use them. They understood the need for conservation, but they didn't always practice it. They recognized the risks of overburning, but they often accepted those risks in pursuit of immediate advantages. Sound familiar? By 10,000 years ago, as the last ice age was ending and human populations were beginning to experiment with agriculture, fire had become thoroughly integrated into human culture and technology. We had learned to create it, control it, transport it, and use it to reshape entire landscapes according to our needs and desires. But we had also learned something else, something that the archaeological record makes clear, even if our ancestors couldn't articulate it. Fire has its own momentum. Once you start using it intensively, it becomes difficult to stop. The modified environments created by burning often require continued burning to remain productive. The species that thrive under human fire management may be less resilient without it. This created a form of technological lock-in that would shape human societies for millennia to come. Populations that had used fire to transform their landscapes found themselves committed to continued fire management, whether they wanted to be or not. The tool that had given them power over their environment had also made them dependent on that power. The transition from fire mastery to fire dependence represents one of the great ironies of human technological development. We had spent millions of years learning to control fire, only to discover that controlling fire meant being controlled by the need to continue controlling it. Archaeological sites from this period show the beginnings of what we might recognize as ecological treadmills, systems where increasingly intensive management was required to maintain productivity in degraded environments. More burning to maintain grasslands that had been created by burning. More fuel consumption to support populations that had grown in response to fire-enhanced resource availability. The stage was being set for the next phase of our story, when settled agricultural societies would apply fire mastery to farming, when permanent settlements would create new forms of fuel demand, and when the controlled burning that had sustained nomadic populations would evolve into the industrial combustion that powers our modern world. But that transformation was still thousands of years in the future. For now, in this crucial transition period, our ancestors were learning the hardest lesson fire had yet taught them, that mastery is not the end of the relationship, but the beginning of a new and more complex one. The flame that had once been their teacher was now their responsibility. The force that had once constrained their movements was now reshaping the world at their command. And somewhere in the smoke rising from their controlled burns, the future was taking shape. A future where human fire would become so pervasive, so powerful, so central to our way of life, that we would forget it had ever been anything other than our servant. The archaeological record ends here, at this moment of transition between the ancient world of natural fire and the modern world of human-controlled combustion. What happens next would be recorded not in stone tools and charcoal layers, but in written history, in the rise and fall of civilizations, in the smoke of countless cities and the ash of burning forests. But the lessons remain the same. Fire gives power, but power demands wisdom. Mastery brings responsibility, and the species that learn to kindle flame in the darkness must also learn to live with the light it creates, and the shadows that light inevitably casts. The story of fire and humanity continues today. In every match we strike, every engine we start, every power plant we build, we are still the fire keepers, still learning to balance the benefits of combustion with its costs, still struggling with the same fundamental question our ancestors faced around their first controlled flame. Just because we can burn something, does that mean we should? The archaeological record can't answer that question for us, but it can remind us that every generation of humans has faced it, and that the choices we make about fire will echo forward into a future we can barely imagine, just as the choices of our ancestors still echo in the world we've inherited. The flame burns on, The question is what we'll choose to do with it. The ember that had taught our ancestors patience was about to become something they could no longer contain. Because around 12,000 years ago, as the last ice age was releasing its grip on the northern continents, something unprecedented was happening in the fertile river valleys of the Middle East. Our ancestors weren't just using fire anymore, they were building their entire civilization around it. The transition wasn't sudden. Archaeological sites like Göbekli Tepe in southeastern Turkey, dating to around 11,000 years ago, show us communities that were still primarily hunter-gatherers, still mobile, still living within the rhythms their ancestors had known for millennia. But something was different. The scale of their constructions, the permanence of their installations, the sheer ambition of their projects, all of it required fire on a level that nomadic groups had never needed. Massive limestone pillars, some weighing over 10 tons, had been quarried, shaped and erected in precise circular arrangements. The logistics alone boggle the mind. How do you move stones that heavy without wheels or draft animals? How do you carve intricate reliefs without metal tools? How do you coordinate the labour of hundreds of people across seasons and years? Fire provides at least part of the answer. Controlled burning could fracture stone along natural lines, making quarrying possible with simple tools. Intense heat could anneal flint implements, making them sharp enough for detailed carving. Constant flames could provide light for night work, extending productive hours beyond what daylight allowed. But more than that, fire was becoming the social glue that held these unprecedented communities together. The hearths at Göbekli Tepe weren't just cooking fires. They were gathering places, ritual centres, the focal points around which hundreds of people could coordinate their activities across extended periods of time. Think about what this means behaviourally. For millions of years, human groups had been small, mobile, largely self-sufficient. Cooperation happened, but it was temporary, situational, limited to immediate family or band members. Now suddenly, we see evidence of communities that could sustain collective projects, requiring generations to complete. Fire made this possible, but it also made it necessary. Once you commit to building permanent installations, you can't simply move when local fuel sources become depleted. You have to develop sustainable systems for fuel procurement, processing, and distribution. You have to organise labour not just for construction, but for the ongoing maintenance of the fires that make construction possible. Archaeological evidence from this period shows exactly this kind of systematic resource management. Charcoal deposits reveal careful selection of wood species optimised for different purposes. Hardwoods for long-burning structural fires, softwoods for quick lighting work flames, specific species chosen for their smoke qualities or heat output. Tool assemblages show increasing specialisation in fire-related implements, not just the simple fire-starting kits of earlier periods, but elaborate systems for fuel processing, heat distribution, and flame control. Bellows made from animal hide to intensify combustion, stone-lined channels to direct airflow, ceramic vessels designed specifically for holding embers or transporting fire across distances. But perhaps most significantly, we begin to see evidence of fire inequality. Not everyone had equal access to the best fuels, the most efficient hearths, or the prime locations near controlled flames. Status distinctions that had been minimal in mobile hunter-gatherer societies were becoming amplified around the management and control of fire resources. The implications rippled outward from those early monumental sites. If fire could be used to coordinate large-scale construction projects, it could also be used to coordinate large-scale food production. If permanent fires could support permanent communities, then perhaps permanent communities could support specialised food procurement systems. Archaeological sites from the early Neolithic show exactly this progression. At settlements like Abu Huraira in Syria and Jericho in the Jordan Valley, we see the gradual transition from hunting and gathering to agriculture, and fire is central to every stage of the process. Wild grasses were burned to clear ground for cultivation. Controlled fires were used to drive game into hunting traps. Harvested grains were processed using heated stones and fire-hardened tools. Storage pits were lined with fire-baked clay to protect surplus crops from moisture and pests. But agricultural fire use created new challenges that hunting and gathering societies had never faced. When you're dependent on wild resources, overburning in one area simply means you move to another. When you're dependent on cultivated crops, overburning means starvation. Early farming communities had to develop entirely new forms of fire discipline, burn schedules that aligned with planting and harvesting cycles, fuel conservation strategies that ensured adequate supplies for critical agricultural operations, risk management systems that prevented accidental fires from destroying entire seasons of work. The learning curve was steep, and the archaeological record preserves evidence of the mistakes. Sites show layers of ash and charcoal that suggest accidental burns consuming storage facilities and settlements. Soil chemistry indicates periods of intensive burning followed by apparent abandonment, suggesting communities that exhausted their fuel supplies and were forced to relocate. But they adapted. They had to. Within a few thousand years, fire-based agriculture was supporting populations larger than anything the world had ever seen. Villages became towns, towns became cities, and cities began to reshape entire landscapes through their fuel demands. The forests of the Mediterranean began to show signs of systematic harvesting. River valleys were cleared for cultivation using controlled burns. Mountainsides were stripped of vegetation to feed the fires that powered growing urban centres. Archaeological evidence from early cities like Çatalhöyük in Turkey reveals the complexity of these emerging fire economies. Different neighbourhoods specialised in different aspects of fire management: pottery firing, metalworking, food processing, textile production. Trade networks developed to transport fuel from distant sources to urban centres where local supplies had been exhausted. But the most profound change wasn't technological, it was psychological. For the first time in human history, fire was becoming something that people owned rather than shared. Hearths belonged to specific families. Fuel stores were private property. Access to fire could be bought, sold, or inherited. This commodification of fire created new forms of social stratification that would define human societies for millennia to come. Those who controlled fuel sources gained power over those who needed fire for survival. Communities that mastered efficient burning techniques could outcompete neighbours who relied on less sophisticated methods. Archaeological sites from this period show increasing evidence of conflict over fire-related resources. Fortified settlements positioned to control access to forests or fuel deposits. Weapon caches associated with areas of intensive timber harvesting, burn destruction layers that suggest warfare specifically targeting enemy fuel supplies. The fire that had once united human communities around shared hearths was beginning to divide them based on differential access to combustion resources. The tool that had liberated our ancestors from environmental constraints was creating new constraints based on social hierarchy and economic competition. Yet the scale of human achievement during this period remains staggering. Archaeological sites across the Fertile Crescent reveal innovations that would have been impossible without sophisticated fire management. Metallurgy that required precise temperature control across extended periods. Ceramic production that demanded specialized kilns and fuel systems. Architecture that incorporated fire-resistant materials and flame management technologies. By 8,000 years ago, human fire use had reached a level of sophistication that dwarfed anything achieved by earlier societies. But it had also reached a level of complexity that made individual communities vulnerable to disruption in ways that nomadic groups had never experienced. When fuel supplies failed, cities collapsed. When fire technologies were lost through warfare or social upheaval, entire populations could face extinction. The mastery that had once provided security was becoming a source of vulnerability as communities became increasingly dependent on systems they could not always control. Archaeological evidence from abandoned settlements tells these stories of fire-dependent societies that couldn't adapt when conditions changed. Sites show evidence of gradual fuel depletion, followed by sudden abandonment. Sophisticated fire installations left unused as communities fled to regions with more abundant combustion resources. The pattern would repeat itself across time and space as human societies continued to grow and spread. Each generation pushed fire technology further, achieved greater scales of production and consumption, and created more elaborate systems for controlling and distributing flame. But each advance also created new dependencies, new vulnerabilities, new ways for fire mastery to become fire servitude. The tool that had once freed humans from natural constraints was creating artificial constraints that were often more restrictive than anything nature had imposed. By the time metalworking became widespread around 5,000 years ago, human societies were locked into fire economies that required constant expansion to remain viable. More fuel for hotter furnaces, more deforestation for growing populations, more complex technologies to extract combustion resources from increasingly marginal sources. Archaeological sites from the Bronze Age reveal the environmental consequences of this escalation. Pollen records show widespread deforestation across the Mediterranean and Near East. Soil erosion patterns indicate intensive land use that exhausted agricultural productivity. Mining sites preserve evidence of fuel consumption on scales that stripped entire mountain ranges of vegetation. Yet the innovations continued. Bronze working led to iron working, which required even higher temperatures and more fuel consumption. Iron working enabled more efficient tools, which accelerated deforestation and agricultural intensification. Each technological advance created new possibilities for fire use, while making societies more dependent on continued access to combustion resources. The archaeological record from this period reads like a preview of our modern predicament. Societies achieving unprecedented levels of technological sophistication, while simultaneously undermining the environmental foundations that made their achievements possible. But there's something else in that record, something we often overlook in our focus on the grand narratives of technological progress. Evidence of restraint, conservation, sustainable practices that some communities developed to manage their fire dependencies. Sacred groves protected from fuel harvesting, rotation systems that allowed forests to regenerate, technologies designed for efficiency rather than maximum consumption, social institutions that regulated access to combustion resources and prevented overexploitation. These weren't universal solutions. Many communities continued to exhaust their environments and collapse. But they prove that even in the earliest stages of fire-dependent civilization, some humans understood the need to balance consumption with conservation. The wisdom was there. The question was whether it would be applied consistently enough to prevent the larger patterns of overuse and environmental degradation that were already becoming visible in the archaeological record. Archaeological sites from the late Bronze Age suggest that this question remained unresolved. Some communities developed increasingly sophisticated conservation practices. Others continued to expand their fire use until local resources were exhausted and social systems collapsed. The stage was being set for the next phase of human fire use, when ironworking would enable even more intensive resource extraction. When growing populations would push fuel demands beyond what local ecosystems could sustain, and when the controlled burning that had once been a tool for survival would become a driver of environmental transformation on continental scales. But that phase of our story extends beyond what archaeology can tell us directly. The written records that document the rise of classical civilizations, the expansion of empires, and the development of industrial technologies represent a continuation of processes that began around those first permanent hearths in the early Neolithic. The archaeological record ends at the threshold of recorded history, but the patterns it reveals continue to shape our world today. The fire economies that emerged from those early agricultural settlements eventually became the fossil fuel systems that power modern civilization. The social hierarchies that developed around fire control became the economic structures that still govern access to energy resources. The environmental consequences that archaeologists document in ancient pollen records and soil chemistry are the precedents for the climate changes we face today. The cycles of innovation, expansion, and resource depletion that marked early fire-dependent societies established rhythms that continue to define human relationships with energy and environment. Most importantly, the archaeological record reminds us that every generation of humans has faced the same fundamental challenge we face today: how to balance the benefits of fire use with its long-term costs, how to maintain the technologies that support our societies without destroying the environments that make those societies possible. Our ancestors solved this challenge imperfectly, temporarily, through constant adaptation and occasional collapse. Some communities found sustainable approaches that lasted for centuries. Others pushed their fire use beyond environmental limits and disappeared from the record entirely. The archaeological evidence suggests that success depended not on any single technological innovation, but on the development of social institutions capable of regulating fire use for long-term sustainability rather than short-term advantage. Those institutions were fragile. They could be disrupted by climate change, warfare, population growth, or technological innovation. When they failed, communities that had seemed stable and successful could collapse within generations. The archaeological record of fire use is ultimately a record of human attempts to live with the consequences of our own power. It documents our species' long struggle to develop the wisdom necessary to manage the tools we've created, to balance immediate needs with long-term survival, to remember the lessons of restraint even when abundance makes restraint seem unnecessary. That struggle continues today. The fire that began as a wild force our ancestors learned to control has become the foundation of a global civilization. The flames that once warmed small communities now power cities of millions. The controlled burning that once cleared patches of forest now drives climate systems that affect the entire planet. The archaeological record can't tell us how this struggle will end, but it can remind us that we're not the first generation to face it, and that the choices we make about fire will echo forward into a future we can barely imagine, just as the choices of our ancestors still shape the world we've inherited. The ember that first flickered in an early hominid's hands has become a global conflagration. Whether that fire will ultimately create or destroy depends on whether we can learn the lessons that our ancestors spent millions of years discovering. That power without wisdom is dangerous, that mastery without restraint is destructive, and that the species that learn to kindle flame must also learn to live responsibly with the light it creates. The archaeological record ends here, at the threshold between prehistory and history, between the ancient world of controlled burning and the modern world of industrial combustion. What happens next is up to us, the inheritors of millions of years of human fire wisdom, the keepers of a flame that now burns bright enough to light the world or consume it. The choice, as it has always been, is ours to make. The fire that had taught our ancestors patience was about to teach us something else entirely. That some forces, once unleashed, develop their own momentum. By the time humans were building the first cities, fire wasn't just a tool anymore. It had become the invisible foundation of everything we were becoming. Picture the earliest urban centres rising along the Euphrates River around 6,000 years ago. These weren't just larger villages. They were entirely new forms of human organisation that required fire on scales no previous society had ever imagined. Every brick was baked in kilns, every metal tool forged in furnaces, every meal cooked over flames that never went out because they couldn't be allowed to go out. Archaeological excavations at sites like Uruk reveal the staggering infrastructure this required. Entire districts dedicated to pottery production, with rows of kilns that operated continuously. Metalworking quarters, where specialised craftsmen tended furnaces day and night. Granaries, where controlled fires dried and preserved surplus grain on industrial scales. But here's what the archaeological record also shows us, something that should make us profoundly uncomfortable as we sit in our climate-controlled rooms, surrounded by the products of fossil fuel combustion. Those early cities were already running into the fundamental problem that would define every civilization that followed. The appetite for fire grows faster than the ability to feed it. Pollen cores from lakes near ancient Mesopotamian cities tell a stark story. Within centuries of urban establishment, the surrounding forests were gone. Not thinned, not managed, gone. Soil chemistry reveals the desperate measures cities took as fuel became scarce. Burning dung, crop residues, even the wooden structures of abandoned buildings. The cities survived, but they had to reach further and further from their centres to feed their fires. Trade networks developed not just for luxury goods, but for the most basic necessity of urban life, something to burn. Archaeological evidence shows cedar timber being shipped thousands of kilometres from the mountains of Lebanon to fuel the kilns and furnaces of lowland cities. Think about the implications. These weren't societies choosing to expand their trade networks. They were societies forced to expand them or face collapse. Fire dependence was driving the very structure of early civilization, creating the first truly global economy based on the simple fact that cities needed fuel, and fuel had to come from somewhere. The social consequences were equally profound. Archaeological sites from this period show increasing inequality based not on land ownership or military power, but on access to fire resources. Elite quarters with elaborate hearths and constant flames. Working districts where fuel was rationed and fires were shared. The gap between those who controlled combustion and those who depended on it was becoming one of the fundamental divisions of human society. But the most chilling aspect of this early fire economy was its momentum. Archaeological layers from successive periods show the same pattern, repeating with increasing intensity. More sophisticated furnaces requiring more fuel, larger populations demanding more cooked food, expanded craft production, consuming more combustible materials. Each generation pushed the system further, not because they wanted to, but because stopping meant collapse. The Bronze Age represents the full flowering of this fire-dependent civilization. Archaeological sites across the Mediterranean and Near East reveal technological achievements that still impress us today. Precision metalworking, massive architectural projects, complex manufacturing systems. But they also reveal the environmental cost of those achievements. Isotopic analysis of ancient ice cores shows that Bronze Age smelting operations were already affecting atmospheric composition on regional scales. Forest cover across entire mountain ranges disappeared to feed the furnaces that produced bronze tools and weapons. Mining sites preserve evidence of fuel consumption so intensive that some regions never recovered their original vegetation. Yet the innovations continued because they had to. Each technological advance created competitive pressures that forced other communities to match or exceed it. Cities that couldn't maintain their fire economies were conquered by those that could. Societies that tried to limit their fuel consumption were outcompeted by those that expanded it. Archaeological evidence from abandoned Bronze Age settlements tells these stories of communities that couldn't keep up with the escalating demands of fire-dependent civilization. Sites show evidence of technological sophistication, followed by sudden abandonment as local fuel sources were exhausted and trade networks failed to fill the gap. The pattern would repeat itself across cultures and continents. Archaeological sites from ancient China reveal similar cycles of innovation and environmental exhaustion. Mayan cities in Central America show evidence of deforestation so complete that some regions couldn't support the populations that had once thrived there. Even isolated societies like those on Easter Island eventually ran up against the limits of what their local fire economies could sustain. But here's what makes the archaeological record so relevant to our current situation. It shows us that every human society that has achieved fire mastery has faced the same fundamental choice. Either develop the social institutions necessary to regulate fire use for long-term sustainability, or continue expanding consumption until environmental limits force a reckoning. Some societies chose the first path. Archaeological evidence from certain regions shows communities that developed sophisticated conservation practices, rotation systems for forest management, technologies designed for efficiency rather than maximum consumption. These societies often persisted for centuries or even millennia, maintaining stable relationships between their fire economies and local environments. Others chose the second path, or perhaps never realized they were making a choice at all. These communities appear in the archaeological record as bursts of remarkable achievement, followed by rapid collapse. Their technological innovations were often superior to those of more conservative societies, but their environmental footprints were unsustainable. The archaeological record suggests that the difference wasn't technological. Both types of societies often had access to similar fire technologies. The difference was cultural, institutional, rooted in different approaches to the fundamental question of how much fire was enough. Sustainable societies seemed to understand that fire was a tool that could serve human purposes without becoming the master of human choices. They used controlled burning to enhance their environments, rather than to transform them completely. They developed social mechanisms for limiting fuel consumption when necessary and sharing fire resources equitably within their communities. Unsustainable societies treated fire as a limitless resource that could be expanded indefinitely. They used combustion to maximum advantage in the short term, often achieving remarkable levels of technological sophistication and material prosperity. But they failed to develop the cultural mechanisms necessary to regulate their own success. The archaeological record from the transition between Bronze and Iron Ages provides a particularly clear example of this dynamic. Iron working required even higher temperatures and more fuel than bronze production, but it also enabled more efficient tools that could accelerate resource extraction and expand agricultural production. Some communities used iron technology to develop more sustainable relationships with their environments. Better plows that reduced soil erosion, more efficient tools that required less fuel to manufacture, improved techniques for forest management and fuel conservation. Other communities used iron technology to intensify their resource extraction to unprecedented levels. Strip mining operations that devastated entire landscapes, agricultural systems that exhausted soil fertility within generations, manufacturing processes that consumed fuel faster than forests could regenerate. Archaeological sites from both types of communities exist in the record, often in the same regions and time periods. The difference wasn't access to technology or natural resources, it was the social choices communities made about how to apply their technological capabilities. The sustainable communities often appear less impressive in the archaeological record. Their sites show evidence of technological sophistication, but not the monumental architecture or massive production scales that characterize unsustainable societies. They seem to have prioritized stability over growth, efficiency over expansion. The unsustainable communities created the archaeological sites that capture our imagination today. Massive temples, elaborate burial goods, evidence of technological achievements that seem almost impossible for their time periods. But many of these sites are also associated with sudden abandonment, environmental degradation, and social collapse. As we approach the end of what archaeology can tell us directly about human fire use, the patterns become increasingly familiar. The rise of classical civilizations in Greece and Rome represents the culmination of Bronze Age fire economies, technological sophistication, and environmental impact on scales that dwarfed anything that had come before. Archaeological evidence from the height of the Roman Empire reveals fuel consumption that affected forests from Britain to North Africa, mining operations that stripped mountains of vegetation, manufacturing centres that required constant imports of combustible materials from across the known world. But the archaeological record also shows us the limits of this system. Late Roman sites reveal increasing evidence of fuel shortages, declining air quality in urban centres, agricultural productivity hampered by deforestation and soil exhaustion. The empire that had conquered the Mediterranean world was being conquered by the environmental consequences of its own fire economy. The collapse of classical civilization marks the end of the ancient fire economies that archaeology can document directly. What came next? The rise of medieval societies, the development of industrial technologies, the fossil fuel systems that power modern civilization, represents a continuation of processes that began around those first permanent hearths in the early Neolithic. But the archaeological record has already shown us the essential patterns. Human societies that achieve fire mastery face predictable challenges. They must balance the benefits of combustion against its environmental costs. They must develop social institutions capable of regulating fire use for long-term sustainability. They must find ways to limit their own power when that power threatens their long-term survival. Some societies have met these challenges successfully, at least temporarily. Others have failed catastrophically. The archaeological record preserves both outcomes as lessons for societies like ours that are still wrestling with the same fundamental questions. The fire that began as a wild force our ancestors learned to control has become the foundation of a global civilization. The controlled burning that once warmed small communities now drives industrial processes that affect every ecosystem on Earth. The fuel economies that once depleted local forests now deplete fossil carbon deposits that took millions of years to form. We are living through the latest chapter in a story that began when the first hominid reached toward flame. The archaeological record can't tell us how this chapter will end, but it can remind us that we're not the first society to face these choices, and that the outcomes of our decisions will echo forward into a future we can barely imagine. The ember that our ancestors learned to kindle has become a fire that threatens to consume the very climate systems that make complex life possible. Whether we can learn to control that fire, to develop the wisdom necessary to live sustainably with our own power, may determine not just the future of human civilization, but the future of the biosphere itself. The archaeological record ends with a question that each generation must answer anew. What kind of firekeepers will we choose to be? The inheritors of ancient wisdom who understand that true mastery requires restraint, or the latest in a long line of societies that discovered too late that some forces, once unleashed, are harder to control than we ever imagined. The flame burns on. The choice, as always, is ours. But perhaps the most important lesson archaeology teaches us isn't about technology or environmental management, it's about time. The deep time that separates us from our fire-making ancestors also connects us to them through the long chain of choices, innovations, and consequences that shape the world we've inherited. When we flip a switch or start an engine, we're participating in the same fundamental relationship with fire that began when the first human hand reached toward flame. The scale has changed, the technologies have evolved, but the essential dynamic remains the same. We are still a species learning to live with the power we've given ourselves. The archaeological record reminds us that this learning process has never been simple or straightforward. Every generation has had to discover anew how to balance fire's benefits against its costs, how to enjoy its gifts without becoming enslaved by its demands, how to remain its master without forgetting the respect it deserves. That learning continues today, in every choice we make about energy use, in every policy we develop about climate change, in every decision we face about how to power our civilization without destroying the world that made it possible. We are the latest firekeepers in a lineage that stretches back through millions of years. The flame we tend was first kindled by ancestors whose names we'll never know, whose faces we'll never see, but whose legacy lives on in every spark we strike. They learned to bring light to the darkness. Now we must learn to live wisely with the light we've created. The story of fire and humanity isn't finished. It's still being written in every choice we make, every flame we kindle, every future we decide to create. And that, bored people, is where we'll leave our journey through deep time tonight. From the first wildfires that taught our ancestors caution to the controlled flames that built our civilizations, we've traced a story that's still unfolding around us every day. Next time, we'll explore what happened when fire mastery met the industrial age, when steam engines and coal-burning factories transformed fire from a tool of individual survival into the driving force of global transformation. We'll see how the same patterns we've traced in archaeology played out on unprecedented scales, and how the lessons of the deep past might help us navigate the challenges of an uncertain future. Until then, remember, every time you kindle a flame, you're continuing a conversation that began when the first curious hand reached toward the light. What you choose to do with that fire, how you balance its power with wisdom, its benefits with responsibility, connects you to millions of years of human experience and billions of years of planetary history. The flame is yours to tend. Use it well. Thank you for joining me in the quiet corners of deep time, where the most important stories unfold not in dramatic moments, but in the patient accumulation of choices, consequences, and wisdom across the vast expanses of human experience. Stay curious, stay thoughtful, and I'll see you next time on Muted History.